I want to bring something up because I mentioned something earlier when we were discussing this, and I think you guys just forgot to respond because I know you guys definitely have some kind of response. The number of species. Okay. We as creationists, we would argue that the number of species fit nicely within a creationist model. Okay. To take birds, for example, we got somewhere between 10 and 17,000 bird species today. We're seeing, and there was a paper recently in 2023. We were discussing it last time, Andrew, where on the Galapagos Island, they've documented new bird species in real time. Okay. So we're seeing speciation occurring quite quickly. So if we were to extrapolate that back, okay, 10,000 to 17,000 bird species in 4,500 years, that fits nicely.
I can answer this.
First, I should ask so I don't misrepresent. How long ago do you put the origin of birds from theropod dinosaurs?
I think that it's like late, like in the Jurassic period. I think
sometime in the Jurassic. It really depends what you're calling a bird at that point, because there's so many transitional features at that point.
But I just want to make the point real quick that you can essentially predict like extinction risk, because obviously a lot of these, like the vast majority of all species that have lived have gone extinct, and you can predict like extinction drift. You can predict extinction risk as a function of the species age, just using like simple like ecological drift models. So
yeah,
like
cool.
Like ecological drift like pretty much explains like the age of certain of most species just as a general trend.
But so if you're taking the origin of birds, let's say Archaeopteryx, you guys would say that's a transitional form. We got traits from theropod dinosaurs and also extant or modern birds. So you would, let's say 65 million to 100 million years ago, the origin of birds from theropod dinosaurs. Well, even with extinction rates, extinction events, today we're only left with 10,000 to 17,000 species of birds. From the flood 4,500 years ago, that makes sense because we understand today that speciation and adaptation can be rapid. If we start with design diversity and those DNA differences are built in from the start, then speciation is really rapid because the ones documenting these new bird species, they obviously are evolutionary scientists, so they don't believe in design diversity, but even they're admitting that speciation is happening rather quickly. We're observing it in real time. So take that back 4,500 years ago, boom, it's easy to account for. Speciation, I just want to finish my thought. So it's easy to account for that many species, okay? But for the evolutionist model, why is there only 10 to 17,000 birds? But you take it back 65 million to 100 million years ago, there should be, hundreds of thousands of bird species. And I get, there are extinction events. But how many extinction events do you have to invoke to explain why there are so few bird species today? And do you have numbers for that?
Ecological
most
drift
species are
for
extinct.
a lot of this.
Well, first of all, species is just an arbitrary category we made up. We'll categorize things into like this is this species because it's one sole category. So we can invent new species by simply stricken up the category. What fits that X in X category.
Well,
they're literally just made up.
I will also note that's very much a continuum as well. So like when you're talking about that 2023 study with that new species of finch, for example, if you looked at the ancestral finch species and the new one, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. They're at the very cusp, basically, of the speciation process, because it's not a matter of, okay, you're one species and then another moment you're a different species. It's a continuum of change, and that continuum takes a very long time, typically.
Well, this is just arbitrary saying, am I identical, like an exact copy of my mother? Of course not. Of course, it's going to be the mixture of those.
Just to answer Donnie's question, like ecological drift goes a long way to explaining how you have like both periods of like lower diversity of species and increasing differences among like otherwise equivalent communities. So like ecological drift is a mechanism by which this happens. And like I said, that it trends very well into predicting like species age and extinction rates.
So when you say ecological drift, and if I missed your definition of it, I apologize. Are you arguing that some species, they can fill a niche to the point where it no longer needs to be filled, and so it remains static and remains that way for a long time, and so there's no need for growth, but then other periods of time there is significant growth? Is that what you mean by
No,
ecological drift?
it's kind of like genetic drift in that it's like essentially a stochastic process. It's just like the changes in like a population size due to like births and deaths over time. Like it's like
So it
essentially a
fluctuates.
stochastic process.
So if there's an extinction event, will it fluctuate upwards for an extended period of time as it rebuilds its numbers and then becomes a little more static, stays at a constant number for more or less for a while?
Here, I sent a link in the private chat of just like a study about it, but I also just recently like saw like basically like an ecological drift model that was able to like it's sort of it's similar to neutral theory, but it's essentially able to model and predict like extinction risk over time for species.
Because
And
I'd like to see, because I would like to see a sophisticated analysis with numbers on whatever species. Name your species. Let's take bird species. I think Nathaniel Jensen has done a very good job accounting for at least the bird species and putting numbers and predictions and so on and so forth. But we could do the same thing with snakes, lizards. You know, there's not a whole lot of lizard species, 4,600. And I think with what Andrew said, because he makes an interesting point that yes, the difference between the new species and the parent species is pretty minor. And so the larger question is, should we even be calling it a different species? Because the number of species per animal that we look at could be inflated. Because depending on if you're a splitter or a lumper, we could prematurely be labeling something a new species just by a very small difference. Where somebody might think, no, that's not really enough to...
It's arbitrary because we can like say, let's see, we get a population of people with Down syndrome in the school. They would be considered a new species technically because the category is Down syndrome. Let's say people with, I don't know, webbed toes because a mutation that's made them, you know, slightly inferior. Well, now the category is webbed toes and we just invented a new species. It's arbitrary. Because you can add up all these, you can keep adding categories and categories and keep inventing species.
Well, this is something I think that was being talked about in the debate with Kent, is this so-called species problem and how there are many different species concepts, because it is true that organisms can't be filed into these neat, tidy categories or boxes that we would like to call species. It's very much more variable than that, and that's why you need to use different information in different areas. With like fossils, for example, you obviously don't have any DNA data left, so you have to use a morphological species concept. So it's valuable for different questions you're asking. But since organisms can't be filed into these neat categories, that's more of a result of evolution, not like created kinds kind of thing.
Well, look, since this line of thinking going down species, this wouldn't be evidence for evolution or against it because it's so arbitrary.
Well, yeah, it's not like a specific, it's not like a numerical prediction, but it's consistent with the idea of evolution, because you wouldn't if lineages are continuously splitting off from each other and diversifying in very different ways, you wouldn't expect
but that's also expected in the creations.
Kind, for example,
like for example, web feet is also expected in the creationist model. So like this is data that doesn't like distinct which one is true. So you need some actual data that actually creates a distinction. So like we both expect there to be web feet.
Well, in that case, I would just ask what would distinguish them then. What unique prediction does creationism make that hasn't been tested yet?
For example,
hey, Donny, I have a question. Would you be okay saying that instead of one ancestral pair of dogs that produced all the dogs that we have now, whatever 300 species it may be, would you be okay with saying that maybe there was a handful of dogs on Noah's Ark rather than just one dog? Like there was like some big dogs, medium dogs, small dogs, 3 pairs of like kind of diverse dogs that would have been interbred once the ark landed, as opposed to just saying that there was one set of dogs that produce Chihuahuas as well as Great Danes. Would you be okay with saying that, or would you still argue that it should all comes from one pair of dogs?
Josh, you already answered that.
Are dogs biblically considered clean or unclean animals?
I don't think that was his question.
I have a thought about those dogs. Well,
because I just want to answer real quick, because depending on if it's clean versus unclean, the Bible says take 7 pairs of some or 2 of others, right? Because there were, so I think it would come down to, because I don't think there's an issue having 2 wolf-like ancestors as the archetype with an incredible amount of allelic variability and potential for change to explain all the different species we see today, which are not a whole lot. And then also with artificial selection, getting all the domestic dogs, about 400 plus domestic dogs that we see
that
today.
Dogs are unclean, Donny, but even them being unclean, like what we would consider how we have grouped dogs nowadays, you know, they may have been seen as different types of animals. Like this one is really big dog, this one is really small dog. So
right, there could have been like the dog kind, there could have been the wolf kind, the fox kind.
Yeah,
could, you know, with felids, I believe that tigers and lions are related. They go back to an archetype that was a felid, but there are some creationists I know that believe there was a tiger kind and a lion kind. So, you know, there's definitely questions there for us to engage, ponder, and study.
Donnie.
The big
for the
issue, I just
dog?
want to say, the big issue is that Noah's Ark can only be so big. So you can only fit
Right.
so many different kinds on it. Like you can't just have every species is its own kind and still everything fit on Noah's Ark.
That's why I would rather have just a pair of canids as an archetype, and from there you get all the different species, and then you get a group of humans. I think the evolutionists would agree. Groups of humans, however many years ago, in evolutionary time, not that long ago, took some wolves, domesticated them. They're even domesticating, from my understanding, foxes today.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, the foxes are becoming a lot more like some of the dog pets that we have.
No, they're just
There's actually been some
qualify
evidence
anything.
that they may have domesticated the mammoth too.
Oh, Donnie, you already asked you, just to clarify. Like, so what happened was Noah, like just like you said, Noah, he got some canines that had the perfect amount of genetic what's the word I'm looking for?
Variability.
Yeah, genetic variability to result in the kinds we see today. That's precisely how it was. I don't know what Josh must have not heard you, because he kept
and remember,
question.
There's a lot of studies out right now that says environment can dictate phenotype. And so if we're saying there's a lot of morphological adaptability built into each kind, well, what happens for the first 1,000 years after the flood, according to the biblical model, is some very harsh environmental changes and conditions. And so a lot of these creatures that come off of the ark, the potential is there in the genome, but also in the environment for a lot of this front-loaded morphological adaptability to be manifested outwardly in change. And then maybe the speciation rate has slowed down after that first 1,000 years after the flood. But I would imagine that speciation rates were probably even quicker for that first 1,000 years after the flood, as these creatures have to migrate to less than ideal parts of the world and rapidly adapt or vary. Go ahead, whoever wants to talk.
If I can add,
Bubblegum wants to talk. Bubblegum, you go.
I was going to address one of the points Andrew made earlier, because he said, like, well, we wouldn't expect a crocoduck, but then, well, we do have an example of that. For example, the platypus. And so are you going to take that as evidence?
What is Mosaic with the platypus?
It's a mammal that lays eggs.
That's the ancestral characteristic of mammals.
Yeah, that's
Andrew's argument was saying, well, evolution
It
wouldn't
lays
expect a
eggs as
crocodile.
venom, gives milk, lactates without nipples. There's so much.
Well,
There's so
venom
much
has
to the
evolved
platypus.
several different times. It's not like uniquely snake venom, for example. It's its own type of venom.
Yeah.
in the
No, no,
platypus.
Like
no,
none of
type
those.
of venom.
Those are
Also, it
peanut-
has
wait.
a sixth
Bubble,
sense.
you were trying to say that was an example of mosaic with things that evolution would not predict it to be mosaic for. But
No,
that's
that,
just
that,
not
no,
the
that,
case.
that was no, that was I was talking about the bear. That was a different argument. That was towards you. I was talking
You
about
said
the
the
bear and the
platypus.
gorilla. No, this is towards a different comment that Andrew made.
Well, he said you wouldn't expect to find a crocodile, and you're trying to use a platypus as an example, but there's reasons why it's not an example of that. Like the bill that a
It's
platypus
exactly
has
an
is
example of
not
that.
anything like a bird or duck bill. They are
Well,
morphologically
what about
the
the
crocodile
elephant
argument is supposed to be like elements of mixed animals? A crocodile,
Yeah, exactly. And a platypus doesn't have that.
Yes, it does. It's a mammal that has venom and lays eggs.
Grayson, what are your thoughts? Because I know you're a platypusologist. I knew when Bubbles brought it up, you're gonna go off on that. So I am curious as to your thoughts on. Correct me if I'm wrong. The platypus has claws like a reptile, and it also has hair like a bear. So how do those?
Okay, because it's a mammal. Nothing about like there are tons of mammals that have claws and tons of mammals that have hair, and yeah, like in terms of the traits of like how mammals evolved, like mammals like evolved from a common ancestor that laid eggs. It wasn't delivering live birth. That's why you have monotremes as the most basal group, which platypus are a part of.
So maybe I can.
What's the precursor to the extant platypus?
Yeah, I'll let Andrew clarify real quick.
Go ahead.
So I just want to clarify my original comment. So in the context of the crocodile, looking at blending features of very distantly related groups, the blending you're concerned with here is blending of features unique to one group and unique to this other separate group, and putting them in the same animal, right? So you can have features that can change pretty easily, like the hair texture or fur or color, etc. If you have an animal that blends some of those, that's not really that important in an evolutionary context. Whereas if you saw like a mammal with distinct bird feathers, for example, that would be an example of a crocoduck kind of thing. The platypus doesn't really qualify for that. I hope that makes sense.
How many mammals lay eggs, Andrew?
The echidna does as well.
Yeah, monotremes. There's like three groups of mammals. There's like placental mammals, there's marsupials, and there's monotremes. Monotremes lay eggs.
So if there's only two kinds of egg-laying mammals on the planet today,
there's four.
What's the other two? We got the monotremes.
There are many.
Yeah, the monotremes have like 4 species today.
Okay,
somewhere around there. 4 types.
But are taxonomists not just forcing these interesting mosaics into these groups where they might not belong?
No, because they also have uniquely mammal features. These are
not just like forced, like arbitrary categorizations. Like monotremes are all genetically more similar to each other than they are to any other types of mammals.
Yeah, right. But just like in the design world, all SUVs are a lot more like each other than if you were to bring in, or crossovers, than if you were to bring in something else, an SUV or a van. So yeah, I get that there's a group, monotremes, that are all very similar to each other, but how can you not argue that they're an interesting mosaic?
Well, because they're more closely related to modern mammals than they are to any other reptiles, for example.
So, okay, any group, any creature on this earth that you pick any creature, it's going to have to, by definition, be more similar to another group and more distant to another. Humans are going to have to be more similar to something, and then more dissimilar. So of course, this interesting group, monotremes, are going to have to be closer to one creature than another. My point is that. Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted clarification on what point you were making with this, because, like, yeah,
my point is
the categories are not arbitrary.
Well, it's just expected on both sides that every single group on this earth, whether it's creation or the evolution model, we're going to be able to pick another group that they're most similar to. So monotremes are most similar to mammals.
Okay. So Donny, are you saying in any scenario you would expect a nested hierarchy? Like there's no biological scenario where a nested hierarchy couldn't have developed. Is that what you're arguing?
Well, pick your creature. It's good. We can find out what it's going to be most similar to, and then
Right, but like,
what it's
just
going
like
to be left.
as a
Okay, wait,
hypothetical.
Donnie. Just because you can, for any species, you can find another species that's the most similar to it. That doesn't mean that you would have a nested hierarchical pattern. I mean, when Linnaeus first,
I would argue it does.
When Linnaeus first noticed this nested hierarchical pattern, he was shocked and couldn't explain it, and he challenged all his peers who, like, this is before evolution. He challenged everyone. How can we explain this nested hierarchy? It was a mystery until evolution.
What? No.
That's like
It's not a
historically.
mystery.
Well, if I
God
was
made-
one of his peers, I could have explained it to him.
Okay, are you saying?
So,
look,
because- let me
Okay,
make
the
an
pattern of
additional
nested
point.
hierarchy is different than just saying these things should be more similar to these things, because you could have like humans.
man,
could be
it's a
most
logical
similar.
necessity. It's a logical necessity. You can't define a dog by giving it the DNA of an alligator. So
Yeah,
all
you're
dogs
just
have
saying
to.
non sequiturs at this point, Bubblegum. But
No,
like,
it's a
just
logical.
because-
That's not a non sequitur. It's a logical necessity. You can't define a dog by using alligator DNA. That's
Nobody's
illogical.
saying that. That's why it's a non sequitur.
Well, that's
Nobody's
what you're
talking about
requesting of
defining dogs
Donnie.
with alligator DNA.
If scientists would have came to the original created kind 6,000 years ago, these created kinds were front loaded with pre-existing DNA differences, and those scientists were to do a genomic sequencing and then comparisons, they're going to conclude relationships that aren't actually there. I mean, these creatures were just created, but with pre-existing DNA differences that would reflect a hierarchical pattern, even though one
Why?
creature didn't descend from another, because pre-existing DNA differences and then similarities in morphology, anatomy, and physiology necessitates a nested hierarchical pattern.
Wait,
Just
first
like-
of all,
So God
the
designed
hierarchical-
Well,
Wait,
it's just
wait,
like
wait.
car companies accidentally. It's not like car companies say, okay, we're going to make vans and SUVs more similar to each other than vans and airplanes, or vans and a tractor, a semi-tractor trailer. No, it's just by accident. Just the fact that they're designing things with similar features and similar parts, that necessitates some kind of hierarchy. But the fact
Well,
that God
would argue
created
that like different manufacturers can create different SUVs or within a single category, sedans, whatnot, that are more similar to a completely different category just by like what kind of engine they have,
Yeah, it's
what kind of
arbitrary.
fuel system they have, then they wouldn't be considered in the same categories that are sedans, for example.
Yeah, the whole
so
nested thing is arbitrary. You like saying like all these
No, it
nested
isn't.
hierarchical patterns. Yeah, that's arbitrary because you can just choose which category you want to go down. And so if
It's
you
not
choose a
arbitrary.
different yes, it is.
This is
And if you wanna go-
reflected in genetics.
No,
Like,
it's not.
it's not
It
an
absolutely
arbitrary
is not. It is not reflected in
yeah, but
genetics.
Okay,
in
here's a
genetics
fact,
is where we
Bubblegum.
find the most dissimilarities.
Here's a fact, right? All mammals are more closely genetically similar to the other mammals than they are to any non-mammals. That therefore, mammal
That's
is not
because
just
it's a
an
logical
arbitrary category.
necessity. That's
What
because
makes
it's
a
a
mammal a
logical
mammal?
necessity.
But anybody on the
Bubblegum,
panel,
calling a
what makes
banana
mammal
banana,
mammal?
is that arbitrary?
I can answer that.
Andrew, go ahead. What makes a mammal a mammal?
Well, yeah. So several things, and this actually gets into the other point I want to make, that a group by itself is not defined by a single trait, right?
Right,
So
it's a group of
mammals are
traits.
right. It's
Right.
a collection of traits. So mammals are defined by a few things, like just thinking off the top of my head, lactation. They have mammary glands. They
Right.
have alpha
Vertebrates.
they have keratinized hair. They have heterodont teeth, so different teeth configurations. You don't see that in reptiles, for example.
What about the middle ear? Is there something unique
Yeah,
about
they
the
have
middle ear?
the free inner ear, middle ear bones, basically. So that kind of thing. So it's defined by a suite of
The
characteristics.
jaw is made up of how many bones?
Less than a reptile. I don't know the exact number, but I think the point that needs to be made is, like, for example, with mammals or just nested hierarchies in general, you wouldn't necessarily expect a nested hierarchy to come out of any biological scenario because of this fact that groups can be defined by many different traits. So,
Right.
for example,
but here's the thing. But let me just, because you did a great job answering, Andrew, and you were
Okay.
right. Warm-blooded, they're vertebrates, so obviously they have backbones, but I guess that wouldn't necessarily be unique to them. But they got fur, hair, they produce milk to feed their young. You can get into the jaw, you can get into the
Yeah, lots
the
of characters.
the skull, the middle ear, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so all of those considering is then by definition, because there's so many characteristics and traits that we're looking at to categorize a creature as a mammal. So we have this group. So of course, this group mammals are all by definition going to be more similar to each other than reptiles, or once you start bringing in amphibians, because they're going to lack that group of traits or characteristics that make a mammal. So why would we ever believe that there wouldn't be a hierarchy in terms of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and then the ones in between?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you could see a more random combination. So for example, you could see what we would usually classify as a mammal with like all the defining mammal characteristics, except it lacks that inner jawbone, or it has a uniquely reptilian feature. For example, it has scales, but it has all the other defining characteristics that we would tend to associate with mammals. So if we had that kind of random combination, then the nested hierarchy would break down. If there was no evolution or modification over time, with this change happens first, and then it's inherited, and then this other change happens for next, and then that's inherited, and so on and so forth, then you wouldn't get a nested hierarchy. You would just have a random mixture of features that would just be due to chance.
Andrew, I appreciate that. I do have some responses, but I want to be fair. Redefine apologetics, my brother. Great to have you. You've been very patient, and I know you wanted to respond and make some points. So feel free to have the floor and respond to anything you'd like to. Just make sure to unmute. I see you're muted right now, and you're good to go.